The only surviving wonder of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid stands today where it has for the last 4,500 years, at Giza in Egypt. Its location has remained unchanged, but its appearance, however, has changed somewhat dramatically since the finishing touches were put to it around 2500 BC. Built as a tomb for the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu, the pyramid was built using approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone. The majority of these were quarried 800 kilometers upstream at Aswan and transferred to Giza in boats down the Nile River. Taking over 20 years to complete the project, the final task for the builders would have been the quarrying, cutting and polishing of the white limestone blocks that would case the entirety of the pyramid. These blocks were polished until they shone in the sun, creating a mesmerizing effect. The blocks were quarried 15 kilometers upriver at Chura and were so tightly packed together that it made it almost impossible to penetrate and gain access to the pyramid. Similar casing stones are still visible at the base of the pyramid and at the top of the pyramid of Khafre. The bent pyramid of Snefru at Dashur has a more complete outer casing, but not quite as mesmerizing or ambitious. As well as the gleaming stones that cased it, atop the pyramid sat a large stone block which acted as a capstone, called a pyramidion. This was perhaps itself cased in gold, so you can imagine the sight of the pyramid shining in the midday sun with a gleaming golden pyramidion at the top. Khufu's pyramid today, up close, looks more of a jumble of stone blocks due to the fact that almost all of the casing stones have vanished. But where have they gone? And what happened to the pyramidion? By the time that the Greek historian Herodotus was visiting Egypt in around 450 BC, the Great Pyramid had been standing for 2,000 years. Herodotus tells us that it was indeed still cased in stone at this time, and on the stones were carved inscriptions of strange characters, presumably the Egyptian script we've come to know as hieroglyphics. Diodorus Siculus, visiting Egypt in the mid-1st century BC, tells us that the pyramid stood complete and without the least decay, and yet it lacked its apex stone. The casing stones were still attached and in fine condition, but the pyramidion, it seems, was gone. This suggests that the capstone went missing at some point during the 400 years between the visit of Diodorus and Herodotus before him. Herodotus does not himself write of the capstone, but the general consensus is that if it had been missing at the time of Herodotus, he would have mentioned its absence. So by 50 BC, the pyramidion was gone, but the casing stones were still firmly in place. In 24 BC, the Greek geographer Strabo visited Egypt and stated that a little way up one side of the Great Pyramid was a loose stone that could be moved for one to enter into it. This is the first historical account which describes the moving of the outer casing stones. The next account, which mentions the casing stones at all, doesn't appear until nearly 1,000 years later. In the 10th century AD, around 400 years after Egypt had come under Arab rule, the Abbasid scholar al-Masoudi wrote a history book called the Meadows of Gold. Within it, al-Masoudi writes a prophetic story of the pyramids of Giza. It is presented as a dialogue between two people, discussing how and why the pyramids were built. For us, the important part is when talking of the building of the Great Pyramid, one person asks, but how were the smooth pyramids built? How could the workers climb up and work? This implies that during the 10th century, the smooth casing stones were still attached to the pyramids. However, by 1638, when the Oxford mathematician and astronomer John Greaves visited Egypt, the casing stones of the Great Pyramid seem to have been removed. Greaves drew pictures of the pyramids. Khafres and Menkauras are drawn with smooth sides, implying the casing stones were still attached. But the Great Pyramid is drawn with a stepped exterior. In addition to this, Greaves' account states of Khafre's pyramid, the sides are smooth and equal, the whole fabric, except where it is exposed to the south, seeming very entire, free of any deformed ruptures or breaches. He does not afford the Great Pyramid the same description, so the casing stones seem to have been removed sometime between the 10th century AD and the 17th century. But what happened? Well, In 1303, a tremendous earthquake on the Greek island of Crete sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean and northern Africa. It had a devastating effect on the monuments of Egypt. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria was badly damaged, and the walls of the city collapsed. Cairo also suffered, with many mosques and minarets collapsing and suffering terrible damage. The earthquake also dislodged many of the capstones of the Great Pyramid, and further earthquakes later in the century would exacerbate the damage. The inhabitants of Cairo, needing stones for repairs, saw the opportunity for hundreds of tons of free stone and decided to strip the pyramid of its casing stones. With the stones, they apparently built the large mosque of Sultan Hassan in the 1350s and continued to remove the stones until the pyramid looked as it does today. While there is a wealth of evidence for the casing stones of the Great Pyramid, the evidence of the whereabouts of the Pyramidion is somewhat lacking. It is a case of adhering to that old saying, evidence of absence is not absence of evidence. Our knowledge of the Pyramidion comes from several sources, the first being the fact that there is evidence that other pyramids in Egypt were topped with a capstone. The second is that the very top of the pyramid is today more of a platform than a point or a peak, suggesting something once stood atop it. From the historical sources, Pliny the Elder, visiting in the early 1st century AD, stated that the total height of the ground to the summit is 720 feet, and the platform on the summit is 16 feet and a half in circuit. We know for certain that it was a platform by the mid-19th century, when a Prussian expedition led by Karl Lepsius climbed to the top and were depicted in a painting celebrating the birthday of their king. Photographic evidence followed when, during the golden age of Egyptomania, around the turn of the 20th century, the trend became to climb atop and picnic. By the time that the pyramid was being scientifically measured by Petrie and others from the late 19th century to today, it has been suggested that approximately 1,000 tons of stone have disappeared from the top of the Great Pyramid since it was built. The platform at the top now measuring approximately 8 meters in width, which is around 2 meters wider than Pliny's estimate. But the question remains, where did the Pyramidion go? We have evidence of several others that have survived to the modern day, most notably that of Sneferu's Red Pyramid, which has been restored and stands in front of the pyramid at Dashur, although there are some doubts about its size and slope angle. This is made from Tura limestone, like the casing stones of the Great Pyramid, and if this is indeed the Pyramidion of the Red Pyramid, which was built the generation before Khufu's at Giza, then it is highly likely that the Pyramidion which sat at the top of Khufu's tomb would also have been made from the same material. In fact, of the 4 satellite pyramids of Khufu at Giza, the Pyramidion of G1D has survived. This is also made from Tura limestone. Although some later capstones were decorated with gold, silver and electrum, there is no evidence that these existed as early as the 4th dynasty. All of this seems to point to the Pyramidion of Khufu being made of Tura limestone. Perhaps in the future, archaeologists will discover the Pyramidion of Khufu, but for now, we can only theorize.